Hi, Devin.
Hey,
How's it going?
it's good. How are you?
Good, good. I am excited to dive into this AMA, also known as an Ask Me Anything. So thank you for taking the time to connect with me today.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Great. So recently at the Learner Center Collaborative, we did a book study of Evolving Education by Katie Martin.
Yes.
And as we went through each part of the book, we noticed that our community was really excited and engaged around the conversation of including community and stakeholders in change management.
Yes.
And when I think about someone who's had experience doing this, we decided that you would be a great person to talk to. So we have
Great.
some people from our community joining as attendees, but I'm going to kick us off with a few questions and then take some from the audience. So if
Sounds
you
great.
are, in the audience, you can go to the Q&A and I'll pull your questions in a bit. Great. So Devin, let me introduce you a little bit more. You
Okay.
are the Chief Executive Officer at the Learner Center Collaborative. You were formerly the superintendent at Vista Unified.
hmm
You are a 3-time California Superintendent of the Year, 9-time White House invitee. Most recently, you authored Learner-Centered Leadership. And some other things I love about you is that you are a dance dad, and you are also a first-generation American.
Yes.
Yeah.
Nailed it. That's a wonderful description, and I'm already humbled and you're setting a high bar with this powerful introduction.
Well, great. Well, as we think about community and stakeholder engagement, I think I just want to define some of those terms as we think about school change and district change. So when you think about who your community is and who your stakeholders are, can you first define for us what that means to you and what that's meant to you in your work?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
Uh, Actually recently did a blog post on this web of interdependencies when you
Yeah.
start thinking about it. So often, there's this idea that education is what happens between a teacher and a student, which is a very simplified perspective, because there's a web of relationships that surround what happens in a classroom between a teacher and a student. So the student has relationships with peers, the student has a relationship with their family, the student has a relationship with individuals outside of that environment, maybe their soccer team or their after school club peer group. So that there's lots of relationships that affect the student beyond what's in that classroom. And similar for the teacher. The teacher is influenced by other teachers at the school. They're influenced by other staff members at the school. The student is influenced by those teachers and students. And then there's the principal, and the principal's influenced by district leaders, and those district leaders are influenced by the board, and everyone's influenced by policymakers at the state level and the feds. And oh, by the way, we're also influenced by local businesses and the Chamber of Commerce and higher education and early education and mental health providers and physical health providers and the libraries. And so if you just start mapping out who's connected to whom, you quickly realize it's not a simple diagram at all. It's a very, very complex web of relationships, which can seem overwhelming, but I think it's also an amazing opportunity to reframe how we can influence learning by recognizing all of these relationships that are already there.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes as that web continues to grow, I know for me at least, it can start to feel a little maybe intimidating or overwhelming to take that first step to start including the community and the stakeholders in different decisions you're making at the school level, district level, or for me, it was at the classroom level of how do I involve my families even more.
Yes.
Um, I think what I'd love if, would you mind walking us through maybe an example that you've, where you've included the community and the stakeholders? Because I think what I want to hear an example from you, but then start to ask questions around like, when did you include? Why did you include? Who did you include? So maybe
Yeah.
let's start with an example and then I can dig a little bit deeper.
Yeah. Uh, and I think you're right. Like no matter what your role is, there's a way to expand this circle of connections, but a story that maybe just gives some insights into my experience and some opportunities. When I was new as superintendent, I was meeting with a lot of different community agencies that provided support at our schools. And Vista is a wonderful community. And one of the things that makes it wonderful is its diversity. And there's a very high percentage of students that qualify for McKinney-Vento homeless services. So there are a lot of community agencies that were trying to provide support to these students who had housing instability. And this is a true story, but we had two continuation high schools. We had a community agency that at one school was providing free shoes for the students, many of whom were homeless. At the other school, we had a different community agency that was providing socks for the students, many of whom were homeless. And I asked the question of each of them, do you know about this other organization? Because it'd be great if the kids had socks and shoes, and like, you're doing amazing supportive work. It's very generous. It's what we need. But, how can we connect these things? And that led to I basically just started mapping out all of these different community agencies. And after a few months of having individual interactions with them, I decided to call a community meeting and invite them all into one space and have them introduce themselves to each other. What is the work that they're doing? How are they contributing? Where is it happening? Is it the north side of town, the south side of town, all of that? And so we ended up in this room with 60 different community agencies, all doing amazing things in the schools. And most of them had no idea about the other organizations that were, in some cases, doing similar things, in some cases, doing different things. And that set the stage for us to end up with a very organized collective impact initiative that ended up having hugely beneficial results across the community. But it's really taking this idea of how can I be a connector? Because a lot of the value in that whole process wasn't me as the intermediary. It was these organizations making connections among themselves for the benefit of our learners. So hopefully that story is a little illustrative of, all of us can be connectors. All of us can expand that circle by inviting people in and being the social host as the leader.
Yeah, I have heard you tell that story before, but it always inspires me to think about how we bring people together to connect, and the socks and the shoes are just such a great example of two parallel work streams that can be happening. And if they're not talking to each other, our students ultimately aren't getting, in this case, both of the things they need.
Yes.
One question I have is around timing. So I work with a lot of schools and districts across the country. They are eager to make big changes, big shifts. And as we start on this pathway of planning for some of that change, there's a moment, there's a pin that we want to put in it to include others. And I wonder for you in your journey, when is that time most valuable? And what I mean by that is, ultimately you want to have a North Star, a vision of where you want to go. And then you want to involve people. Sometimes if you involve others too early, it can shift your North Star, your goal. If you involve people too late, maybe they don't feel as bought in or like they have a stake in the change. Would love your advice on timing.
It's always now. Like it is right now is the time to involve others. Regardless of what you've done in the past, now is the time to be asking that question. And a lot of that is because of this phenomenon that like we take ownership over things that we contribute to and when we're participants. And so I love, there's a quote from Myron Rogers, who's a writer and a mentor of mine. He says, the process that you use determines the future that you get. And basically, if you think about an outside in model versus a more inside out organic model, an outside in model, if you use that process, the future that you get is also going to have that outside in orientation. And if you really want to have inclusivity, you really want to have ownership, you really want to have a sense of community, then the process you use to get to that should be inclusive, community-based, participatory at every stage. And so, maybe an example of that would be my first day as a superintendent. I launched a survey across the community and said, tell me what I need to know about being a superintendent, how, what's working for you, what's not working for you. I had a lot of input on my first day. I didn't even really know what to do with it but it was helpful to set the stage of we're going to do this together. And, so weeks or months later, when we started to do community convenings, we had huge turnouts for a lot of these. And one of the things that I heard in that was you started asking us for input on your very first day. And because of that, we feel like we should lean in and give you more input and be more involved. And so when I say the time is always now, the way in which you're asking people to be involved might get more intensive over a period of time, but you can start today and really asking the question, like, who cares about this? How can I get their input? How can we start to work together? It can start today and should be an ongoing process.
I'm going to hone in a little bit more on learner-centered changes.
Mm-hmm.
So when we think about, the work we do here at LCC, we're often shifting things like outcomes, assessment practices, learning models, making learning feel more authentic and meaningful. We're thinking about learning outside of the four walls of the classroom. In that example, who are the stakeholders to you? Who are we involving in that shift?
Well, I go to the Margaret Wheatley question. Who cares about that? Who cares about the success of our students? Who cares about how we demonstrate the success of our students?
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you frame it in that way, you realize it's a lot of people that really care about our students.
Right.
I mean, the students themselves, first and foremost,
Mm-hmm.
their families, but it's also many people in the community, not just their like immediate families, but their grandparents, their cousins, their aunts and uncles, and it's higher education, it's workforce preparation, it's employers, it is, city and county agencies. It ends up being everybody cares about these things.
Right.
So I think what you want to try to do is then think about, well, how do we at least make the invitation for anybody to be involved in this? So a specific one would be family involvement. So, one thing you could do is go to a PTA meeting and say to the PTA, we're going to start doing some work around whole learner outcomes. Who wants to be involved in it? But that group is not representative of all the families, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's usually, even at a school that has high participation in the PTA, it's not universal. It's not 100%. So if that's all you do, it's a good step, but it's not going to provide the invitation to all.
Right.
So you then want to think about, well, how do we reach every family, regardless of their circumstances? And, we did things like we had a food truck that went out into the community, and on the food truck, we would empower the workers to ask questions about outcomes and what success means. And maybe you can show up at a meeting where we're going to talk about what success really means for our students. We would go to some of the apartment complexes that high density, lots of families in them. We would send staff out to try to set up a meeting in the apartment instead of at school. We would do it on a weekend instead of an evening, because sometimes families working in service industries are working in the evenings. Sometimes they're working on a weekend too. But the point is to vary your modes of engagement and interaction to try to make it as inclusive as possible. And it's all about making the invitation. We invite you to participate in this process. I'm a parent of 2 kids. I'm not involved in everything that they're doing, but there are some things that I'm more involved in, and I appreciate the opportunity to be invited to participate, so that it then becomes my choice to either lean in or not.
Thank you for sharing that. When you shared about the food truck, it made me think about the medium, the how. I heard you say surveys. I heard you say food trucks, going into the community, talking with the community. What are some other hows that you have found to be effective?
Yeah, good question. Social media is really powerful, and schools for a long time, I think, were sort of afraid of what would happen in this open space. But, if you think of what people are doing on their phones, it's a lot of social media. So if you're involved and connected, you are contributing and inviting people into it. And if you as a school leader are not in that space, you're missing out on a lot of conversations. Some of them are difficult conversations, but my encouragement is like, be in the space, in that digital space, really important. But I also think another like underutilized strategy is empowering the whole team to be ambassadors and to be involved. And when I say the whole team, I'm thinking of the staff at a school. So when I was a principal, one of the most powerful community ambassadors that I had was the school custodian. And it wasn't because of his title, it was because of who he was as a person.
Mm-hmm.
And he just had a way of engaging with everybody, but parents in particular felt a high level of trust in him. And so if he was included, he, the custodian, in these conversations, and he was able to then extend those in his interactions, so much more powerful. And I think if you just looked at the titles and you said, okay, we're working on assessment, you might not include the custodian in that conversation.
Right.
But if you really think about it more from that web of relationships, you realize that regardless of title, there are a lot of people that can have an influence, a positive influence in the development of new and better opportunities for all learners. And so if we can sort of suppress our own conditioning around title and expectation and just say, like, we're all part of a learning community, how can we all lean in? I've seen better things happen with that more expansive mindset.
Great. I just wanted to share a reminder with our attendees that you can post your questions in the Q&A. This isn't Ask Me Anything, so you can ask Devin anything you want. We're choosing to talk about stakeholders and community, but it really could be anything, any burning question that you have. One question I have is around student input. So if we really zoom in on who we're focusing on here and who we care about, it's the learners and their experience. What's an example of a change that's happened because of learner input, and how was it gathered and how did it influence change?
Yeah, I have so many stories I could tell around this. And I just want to reinforce, like, the central thesis of that question is there is this strange thing where we often don't ask the people most affected by what we're trying to do, how it impacts them and how they feel about it. And I've given this example in other cases, but when we were creating a strategic plan, I likened it to, modernizing my house. If I was going to fix up my house, before I start making changes, knocking out walls and rebuilding stuff, what should I do? I should consult with the people affected. In my house, that's my wife, my kids. They should have input. They should be involved in this, right? But if you take that same analogy and you go to schools and you say, we're going to make a change in our school, well, who's affected by it? The students are affected by it. And so often we don't even ask them. And so we then end up, making these changes, thinking it's what is going to be helpful. And we often are like misinformed, uninformed, misaligned. So I can give some concrete examples of like where student input led to surprising results. One story that I like to share is around principal of a new school. we were surveying students around what do we need to do to improve the school. And one of the things that came through the surveys was on the tetherball court, there needs to be a stripe to show which side you're on. And this is a gorgeous new school. We had attended to, we thought everything, but we didn't notice that there was no stripe there. And so the custodian one morning goes out to paint the stripe in the middle of the court. And at first I was like, why is he doing it in the morning? We have all these parents dropping off. There's big crowds of people. Why doesn't he do it at night when no one sees it? Anyway, it turned out that you had this big crowd around watching him paint this stripe. And all these kids are like, we told them they needed to paint a stripe, and they're painting a stripe. They're high-fiving each other. The parents are applauding. It was like this, you know, if it was a Disney movie, this would be like a signature moment in the movie, painting a stripe on the tetherball court. So I share that story to say, like, sometimes the things that make a difference and are actually empowering are not super complicated, and it's just blind spots that we have. And if we don't ask the questions, we don't know. If we know and we can act upon it, that builds confidence and trust for people to give you more input, more involvement. We are higher levels of trust lead to more vulnerability and openness. So anyway, that's one story. But in my book and in other places, I've also talked a lot about how input through student forums really led us to develop a new learning model. And it was the student input that led me to recognize that we had a system that was focused on compliance, and kids were feeling tired, bored, stressed. They were not seeing the meaning and the relevance in their learning. And that was the impetus for us to create personal learning at the time. Now we, have evolved from that. We call it learner-centered education, but we made huge shifts in the learning experience for thousands of students. And you could draw a straight line to it was students who told us what we should be doing differently. And it led us to create something that would not have been possible without their input.
Thanks for sharing, Devin. I have a question for you that popped in. It's hopefully a simple one. It's just, what do you do at LCC? What do you do at the Learner Centered Collaborative? And what's your role in that?
I should ask you that question. No, we have an amazing team at Learner Centered Collaborative. So I'm the CEO, but I'm surrounded by incredibly talented people. And a lot of the work that I do is make sure that we have a strategic frame in place: vision, mission, values, goals, roles and responsibilities, plans for us to implement what we hope to see in the world. And so, our vision is that we see a future where there are education ecosystems that empower all learners to know themselves, thrive in community, actively engage in the world as their best selves. And for me as a CEO, like that is my work. How do we get closer to that vision every day? How we do that is through our mission, which is we partner with educators to define whole learner outcomes, create meaningful learning experiences, and also the enabling conditions for their unique and inclusive journey to learner-centered education. So that's kind of the how. And then we have values around being trusted partners, approaching the work with courage, being inclusive, being impact-driven. And so, yeah, to me, like the role of the leader is hold firm on vision, mission, values, and help the team to then operationalize. And I feel really, really lucky. We have an incredible, incredible team. We're working with hundreds of schools across the country, and to see the interest in a change to new and better models of teaching and learning is really, really inspiring.
I agree. Another question came through for you. I want to make sure we get to them. This one's just about how to get started. So if you are someone working on some change management, and they came to you and they said, hey, Devin, I just need some advice on how to get started with involving my community and my stakeholders. I know the time is now. I know I have this big web to access. Yep. What's the advice you would give me to get started?
So first question is like, are you really clear about what you're trying to achieve? And if not, how can you involve others in getting to that clarity? What's your purpose? Second, once that purpose is defined, how can you invite others into that common purpose? How can you create the call, the invitation for that to occur? And then third, how can you identify some feedback loops that are going to inform your journey? Because whatever you're trying to achieve, it's going to be a learning process. And so it's about purpose, participation, and feedback. Those are the three circles in the learner-centered leadership framework. And so start with purpose, build out participation, make sure you have a strong sense of feedback. And those concepts come from a lot of insights around not only human behavior, but how interdependent systems flourish. So purpose, participation, and feedback are the three things.
Thank you. Now we have a few more popping up. So thank you for that. And the next question is around some of the things that your partners are doing. So you had mentioned at the Learner Center Collaborative, the what that we do is partnering with schools and districts across the country to help them move forward in their learner-centered work. And this question is around highlighting some of the partners that you work with. What's inspiring you right now? Have you seen a partner that you want to share something that they're doing?
Yeah. So it's a little bit of like recency bias in my answer.
Of course.
I've been in some of these schools recently, so they're like, they're on my mind. But we have a partnership with the Utah State Board of Education around personalized competency-based learning. I had a chance to go visit some schools and look for exemplars of those practices. And it was really, really exciting to see the energy around state level support for a lot of the changes that I think as a district leader, I've been wanting to see for a long time, and to see the excitement and energy in that setting was really fantastic. And some of the schools are doing incredible things around defining those whole learner outcomes, thinking about ways to make that learning visible. JUAB school district is one that I just was really inspired by. Kentucky, we have been working with a couple of school districts there. Logan County schools have been working intensively with our Chief Impact Officer, Katie Martin. That's then led into now we're at the stage where they've defined their learner profile. They have their competencies, they have their indicators, they have evidence of success, they have their learning model, they have educator competencies, they have lots of the infrastructure in place. And now they're really thinking about how do they surface learning through a student dashboard. And so that's a very exciting project. We were also just at Design 39, which is in Poway, close to where I live, a couple of days ago. They're just doing phenomenal things around learner agency and empowering their students to create their own pathways. So that's exciting. Lighthouse Schools in Oakland, I was there a couple of weeks ago. They are really focusing on relationships as the foundation for powerful learning. So there are so many incredible things happening across our country. And we try to highlight these in lots of different ways. If you're not signed up for Katie's Bright Spots newsletter, that would be one. Every week you're gonna get some windows into some of the really amazing things happening, not just in our partnership network, but in the world of education as a whole. And I think we can all learn a lot from those bright spots.
One more question for you. How did your background as a first-generation American influence your experience in school?
Yeah, I've talked about this in some other places, but I can remember everything about the day being a 7-year-old second grader where it clicked that there was something different about me because of my cultural background. My dad's Czech, my mom's Dutch. We have, traditions like name days and foods that, are unique to those cultures. And we all have our own identities, but it really hit me that mine was different than everybody else at the school because there were no other Czech Dutch families in this rural small town school. And what I found interesting from that point forward was to try to see if that difference was noticed. Was it appreciated? Was it celebrated? And for the most part, it was ignored in my educational experience. It just wasn't brought up. There's very little in the standardized US curriculum around Czechs and the Dutch. Like, it's just and so the way that felt to me was like I wasn't being seen. I felt like I was invisible. That my whole self wasn't being, it wasn't noticed. And the signal that sent to me was, well, maybe I'm not supposed to bring my whole self into school. Maybe I'm supposed to just like bring the parts in that fit with this experience. But that is not a real great feeling as a young person to have. And I think that phenomenon is not at all unique to me. Like, everybody has something unique or different about them. And if we are not recognizing and celebrating the unique strengths and interests and identity of every single person, then we're not bringing their whole self into the learning process. And I think this is one of the reasons that we see a lot of disengagement, especially over time in schools. And in, doing a lot of student forums, I've heard so many students saying, well, I know who I am, but what's happening at school is not connected to me. And so I'm just going to check out. I'm going to disengage. I'm going to drop out. And I think it's a real missed opportunity, because if we take a different frame around it, an asset-based frame, strengths-based view, we would see those differences not as something to be ignored or as problematic, but we would see them as beneficial, and we would all get better from that. So I hope that we can make that shift for the benefit of all individuals, but also for us as a collective society.
Thank you, Devin. At LCC, we often talk about the enabling conditions for a learner-centered education. One of the questions that just popped up was, what is the role of technology in a learner-centered education? How can we view it as, enabling condition for this work that we're doing? And yeah, what's your view on that?
Yeah, so in our framework, the enabling conditions, we have culture, coherence, and connectedness. And I've talked quite a bit about some of the parts of coherence, like the strategy, the vision, the mission, the values. The culture is really, really important. Relational trust is important. Building capacity is important. But connectedness is also really important. And there's a huge role for digital resources in promoting that connectedness in the ecosystem. So even when I was talking about different ways of engaging with families and with community and saying we should use social media, there are all sorts of technological resources that can help us to be connected with one another, many of which we have not fully appreciated for various reasons. And I think one of the silver linings of this pandemic is, imagine how much harder it would have been if we hadn't been able to connect with each other through Zoom and through Google and through these digital learning platforms. Like, if we didn't have that level of connection, it would have been so much worse. And so the pendulum kind of swings back and forth. Like, there have been points where I think people say, oh, technology can't replace a person and we need to just have no technology. And I think, maybe in the pandemic, there was an understanding like we do need the technology, but now I almost feel like the pendulum swinging back. Some of the educators that I'm talking to are saying, since we're in person, we're just, screens off, no devices. And I hope there's something in between these extremes, which is a little more balanced, which says, technology can be an accelerant. It can be beneficial. It can help us to be connected. It's a tool. It's all about how we use it and not about the tool itself. And so anyway, I think it should not be ignored. It should be used thoughtfully, strategically, in pursuit of the purpose that we have, in a way that builds participation and also helps us to have more tight feedback loops to accelerate our collective learning, individual and collective learning.
Yeah, and I think that when I think about technology, I often think about the students first, but we've also seen in our own ecosystem that educators across the country are excited to connect using technology. And, you know, sometimes this work can feel a little isolating, and it's so nice to know that technology can be that thing that can break down the barrier and connect you with someone a few states away who might be trying to solve the same problem as you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, you know, props to you, Kelsey. You set
Oh,
up this Slack channel
yeah.
around the book club, and that has really led to creating this very vibrant community
Yeah.
of people who otherwise would not have had the opportunity to connect and learn from one another. And, you know, sort of like my example before about bringing the community agencies together and letting them interact with one another. I think in the Slack example, you provided that convening function. You've created the space for people to come together, connect and share. And that's amazing. It's wonderful. We need to do more of that. Not just for ourselves at Learner Centered Collaborative, but all of us need to be creating the spaces for those connections.
Right, right. Well, I don't see any other questions, Devin, but is there anything else that, as we think about community involving stakeholders in this change management, anything else we should be thinking about before we close out?
Well, the last thing I would say, which touches on one of your earlier questions, is like, as we're thinking about it ourselves, like whether we should invite people in or not, one of the questions that I like to ask is like, well, what happens if we don't? What are the risks of inaction? And I think we kind of know what happens if we're not inclusive and if we're not intentional about expanding the circle of involvement. What tends to happen is the work is very difficult, it's very isolating. We don't see changes, spreading in the way that we would like to in the educational space as a whole. And so when you're thinking about, well, it might be risky to ask other people to be involved, there's a huge risk in not asking them. And so I just want to, share that framing as a way to give you encouragement and the courage to say, the status quo is not acceptable. And so I need to make a change. And one of the changes I'm going to make is I'm going to ask people to be involved. I'm going to at least create the invitation and see what happens. And together, amazing things are possible. And we know by ourselves, the range of options is more limited. So keep that in mind. I encourage you to ask people to be involved. And if you ever need help, like, keep the conversation going too. We're here to help.
Great, Devin. I think that's the perfect way to close out. So thank you for taking the time. I hope we can do more of these Ask Me Anythings as different themes come up in our community, as people are interested in engaging around different topics. We're here to help. We're here to chat about it.
Great. Thank you for including me in the process. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk soon.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.